Hi, and thank you for joining me for another video. And friends, this week's Parsha is Parashat Miketz. And the Parsha begins with the Pharaoh having the dream that will ultimately determine the future of his kingdom. And friends, one of the more noticeable aspects of these early Parshiot is that, that non-Jews, or at this time those not in the covenant, are really not depicted as irredeemable as much of later Jewish literature describes them to be. As a matter of fact, I would say that at least according to the characters mentioned in the beginning of the Torah, in these Parshiot that we happen to be in, the non-Hebrews seem almost as ethical as the Hebrews themselves, or at least as usable by the Almighty in an ethical fashion to accomplish His will, which is what we see here in the beginning of the portion, with the cupbearer's testimony appearing as Joseph's salvation. As a matter of fact, it even states that right when the cupbearer remembered Joseph, he says that I am reminded of my shortcomings. Because if you remember last week's portion, the cupbearer promises Joseph that he will put in a good word about him with the Pharaoh when he gets out. A promise that he doesn't remember till remorselessly this day. So in other words, this was no amoral individual. He shows his regret for his actions, to the point that even the Pharaoh in the narrative seems to be a fairly reasonable individual. Polytheistic for sure, but still fairly decent, at least according to the narrative. In other words, it would seem a bit easy to blur the lines on who's working against who and who's on whose side, which teaches, unlike what you may have heard, that this Torah does not separate people by race, ethnicity, or blood, but solely, my friends, by actions. And friends, the reason this is so important, especially in the beginning of the narrative, is to help the reader understand that without a proper ethical code, all of humanity is equally hopeless, and with a code equally redeemable. And if the Jew was intrinsically superior and the non-Jew intrinsically inferior, the Torah would have mentioned it by now. Not to mention that virtually every Hebrew in the narrative so far can only really claim a non-idolatrous lineage for about 3 generations. And actually, from their mother's side, none. And the way this ties into this portion is that through Egypt's elevation of Joseph, my friends, is the first inkling of the world benefiting because of Abraham's seed, a fulfillment of what we read promised to Abraham in Parashat Lech Lecha, and to every other patriarch from then on, to the point that even our sages wrote that Joseph would not distribute food unless the people circumcised themselves first, teaching us, friends, that you cannot claim to be righteous unless you are religiously altruistic first. In other words, unless your righteousness doesn't only extend to you and yours. And then the portion continues describing Yaakov's unhealthy relationship with his youngest son, Binyamin, a clear lesson that he failed to learn with his earlier son, Yosef, which, if you think about it, is why he finds himself in Egypt in the Parsha to begin with. To the point that we even see later in the Parsha that Yaakov is willing even to sacrifice Shimon to prevent Binyamin from even visiting Egypt. Which, if you think about it, really shows the religious digression in the scale of the patriarchs, and how a few portions back we saw that Avram Avinu was willing to sacrifice his only son for the greater good. And here, in this portion, we see that Yaakov doesn't have one, but he has 12 with the loss of Joseph, including Dinah, and he doesn't even want to let his youngest son go on a trip to save his older brother Shimon. And this, my friends, is why it is Abraham who's the father of our faith, and the only individual till then religiously mature enough to be appointed by the Almighty for the task of bringing Torah to the world. As a matter of fact, I would go as far to say that it is predominantly through the life of Yaakov and beyond that we first begin to see the Almighty's patience and mercy in the Torah. A patience and mercy that we see only amplified through the coming Parshiot. Especially with this example of Binyamin and Yaakov, that we see that the Almighty doesn't cause him to lose another son because of his shortcomings, but rather allows him to enjoy the rest of his life in peace. Which teaches us a principle that with the present day explosion of mysticism seems to fall on deaf ears. And that's that the main sign of physical and intellectual maturity, according to this Torah, is really gauged on how much supernatural intervention you need in your life. In other words, how much help do you need before you can begin helping others? Which is exactly what we saw in the life of Yaakov, that because of all his earlier troubles, he lacked order in his house, which if you think about it, was the sole purpose for the Almighty intervening with Torah in the first place. To give humanity a do-it-yourself guide to keep moving forward, even though we may have trouble. And another reason why we were commanded on a daily basis to teach this to our children and to our children's children, so that they don't have to suffer because of us, like we see the children of Israel suffering in this parsha because of their father's favoritism. And a quick note, it's one thing to have favoritism due to how responsible and caring someone may be, and then favoritism just because who that child's mother happens to be, which is the case here in this parsha, because it's no secret that Joseph and Benjamin were both the children of Rachel, which was the wife that Yaakov loved more. And one could even say that a good litmus test that you're in a right state of mind is if you're capable of helping others with their problems and not just completely engulfed within yourself and your problems. But anyways, friends, the portion goes on describing the lengths that Joseph is willing to go to see if their brothers are truly remorseful for the way they treated him, which brings down yet another principle, my friends, that you can't forgive others unless they realize their shortcomings first. Which, if you think about it, is really a synopsis of human history as described in the Torah, on how in the beginning, Parashat describes man at one with God, learning from the words of God till man thinks he can do better on his own, which puts us here where we find ourselves in the biblical narrative today, and only reiterated by every one of the following portions till the giving of the Torah, the actual fulfillment of man overcoming his evil inclination, or indecision as described in Parashat chapter 3, of him crushing the head of the serpent. Now, friends, if you're hearing me today and you're sick of living a life of trial and error and want to also, once and for all, put an end to your indecision, I want to welcome you to take hold and live by the Almighty's guidebook for humanity, to live by His Torah. For more information on converting to Judaism, please visit doordea.com or bejewish.org. Thank you.